So training, we're gonna do it, guys. So really what we're talking about today is that Pearl and I have 4 goals. We wanna help you understand 4 things, and that's how your positions came to be, like how youth employees as a thing came to be with incorporating youth perspective into people's roles in organizations. Number 2, who decides and oversees which organizations around Colorado get funding. 3, why the people who are making those decisions make the decisions that they make in the first place. And 4, how you can use that information to kind of do whatever you want to do, right? Like we want to help you sort of figure out what your goals are and to have the language and the understanding of how state systems work so that you could get more money for a cool program, or that you know how to accomplish something like some sort of project in your community. And that's really what we want you to know about. The way that we got to talk about that, though, is that we got to cover what systems are in the first place. What is a system? How do systems in Colorado work? I know that sounds a little boring. We are going to do the best we can to make it fun and engaging for you guys, and really so that you guys can leave feeling like you have an understanding of how this stuff works, and that you have sort of connected with each other and have some other folks that you feel like you can reach out to around the state. So first of all, I'm going to answer the first thing I just said that we would tell you about right now. It's how your job became a thing. And so when I say your job, I'm really referring to in general this idea of, it used to be called the Youth Advisor Model, that started in about 2012 at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And it was the idea that we should hire young people for their perspectives related to work that concerns or affects young people. So the original youth advisors right here, they were NChem and Leslie. They worked at the state health department. And again, they were brought in to basically give their youth perspective on different stuff that affected young people around the state. So Leslie worked on a lot of sexual health projects, and then NChem here worked on stuff that was related to like youth systems in general. And so this ended up being very successful, which was really exciting. And so we ended up expanding this model to other organizations. And Sedona is actually right there, so that's exciting. Sedona has been working as a youth employee for quite a while. This was back when she was at Denver Public Health. And so you can see that we started hiring more and more people across different organizations, which was super exciting. And then in the past few years, this model of the youth advisor model, it's really expanded across the entire state of Colorado. And the reason we're sort of referring to youth employees now rather than youth advisors is that with that expansion of the model happening, there were also changes that were occurring, right? Between the sorts of roles that people were taking on. But the same thing that sort of united all of us youth employees was that we were being hired to give our youth perspective, working on stuff that affected us in some way. So like I said, I worked at the state health department too. This is me over here. Here's Katya. We have multiple people here who remember some of this. And yeah, it's super cool because it started out as like a pretty like Denver metro area centric kind of model. And it's really been implemented statewide, where all corners of the state, rural, suburban, and urban areas, community level organizations, state agencies, really feel like they see a lot of value in this idea of youth employees. And so with my program, as Cassie mentioned, she actually works with me and she's sort of my youth employee now with our own program in rural Gilpin County. Any questions about how your job became a thing, like in this sort of like broad overview? Awesome. Okay. Pearl is going to cover this. Just let me know when you want me to play the video.
So we're kind of going to shift into like, what is a system? Like, what is a system anyway? And some of you may have seen this really cool video, but I like thinking about systems and systems change with this model. So hopefully we can hear the sound. We'll have Catherine make sure that we have our share your computer sound on, and we'll watch this quick video and we'll debrief and we'll talk a little bit about state systems. So anytime you're ready. I can't tell if it's me frozen or the computer. Does anybody else?
No, working? This is me. I'm figuring stuff out. Hold on, guys.
Okay.
Zoom problems. Let me just make sure this is.
I feel like Zoom problems are a requirement.
There we go. Well, maybe. Yes. Perfect. And we have sound. Thank you.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Awesome, thank you. So, what are your initial thoughts when you watch that video? What does it make you think about?
So one thing I've often said is that ecosystems need biodiversity to thrive and remain resilient. And I would say the same is true for our systems and community. We really need to be like uplifting diversity of ages, of perspectives, backgrounds, lived experiences, to be able to have a thriving system or community, and to remain resilient. So that's one connection I saw.
The donut taking it to the next level. All right. Wow. Stasi in the chat. How one small thing, person or organization, can influence huge change that's not directly related to what they're doing, right? Yes, absolutely, right? I didn't know you were a zoology major. How fun. What a great thing to learn about you.
Thank you.
So yeah, so a system is essentially interconnected, you know, in this sense, an ecosystem, right? It could be your body system of nerves and like your nervous system and your circulatory system. Or when we think about systems and what we're talking about today, we're thinking about lots of big systems. And so when we think about systems and thinking systems, we think about, you know, well, we're going to do activity. I don't want to give away the answers, but you know, we're thinking about how important your job is, right? And if you look at what Catherine just shared about positive youth development and strategies in youth engagement, how introducing one youth advisor has led to system-wide changes across the state for youth voice and engagement, right? And so again, this is where we're going with this conversation today, specifically around your job and how it connects to what we're doing, and how we can all be the change we wish to see from the inside out, right? Because sometimes I think we get really frustrated and talk about our systems because they're big and immovable and hard to change. And yet one policy or one small change, introducing wolves into Yellowstone, can end up changing not only the animal patterns and behaviors, the migratory patterns, but the rivers themselves. So pretty powerful. All right, so we're going to do a Jamboard example. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
We have this thing about defining state systems. Pearl, did you want to talk about that briefly? Like
I wanted to talk about that after, I think.
Okay, sweet. Perfect. I'm going to post in the chat a link for myself and for everybody else. So if everybody can open up that link, and then I'll also have myself sharing the screen. Sweet. So what we're going to talk about is what some state systems might be. And Pearl and I, to be honest, struggled with this a little bit of like, how do you even talk about like what systems are and like make that in a way that's understandable and interesting to people. And so I basically said, I think that the way that we should start out is just think about the sort of things that we know that state government addresses. And so this is a Jamboard. If you guys haven't used one before, you can go over on the side, if you can see where my cursor is hanging out, and you can put up a sticky note. So I might be like, health, and then you can save it. Somebody beat me to it already. So we can move those around. And I just want you guys to think about all of the things you can think of that the government does. If you're like, I know that the state of Colorado does this, that's awesome. If it's just more local for you, if it's something that you're just like, I know government provides this general thing, that's also great. And just type as many answers as you can. You're not going to be judged. And while people are typing, I'm going to go through and actually start sorting these. Okay. We have a lot of health, which makes sense. A lot of us work in health. We have education. Great. I'm going to put up higher education, right? Because there's like local schools and then there's universities. That might be near there. Immigration system. Oh, I think me and Pearl are trying to drag at the same time. And another one. Money. Sweet. So I am curious. I would love if you guys put in the chat which part of like these systems that you feel like your job falls under. And if there's multiple, you can put multiple. Sazi says maybe public health because of substance use and prevention. Sedona said public health, MCH, environmental and infrastructure. Yeah, I'd love to know what other folks think. I'd also love to know if like people don't know and you're sort of like, my job doesn't fit with any of these things. Ruben says transportation and infrastructure. Cass says transportation and child welfare. Cam says education, transportation, public health, immigration, potentially. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So what I'm noticing with these things so far, right, is that our work, Lauren's saying public health, infrastructure, and transportation. Yeah. So like a lot of our work, it doesn't actually just fit into one of these things, right? Like even though Sedona's job is at the state health department, that doesn't mean she's necessarily just in like health or public health, right? She's still touching on a bunch of other stuff with her position. But this is kind of the way that we end up at the state level, that things are sort of like sorted out into different categories, right? That there's the Department of Transportation, there's the Department of Human Services, which has the Office of Child Welfare, right? Like there's all of these different departments or offices that sort of focus on like this one particular thing, except a lot of our jobs actually, they sort of expand beyond that, right? But we can see that we're part of these overall systems. And we know that like for myself, if, or like actually I'm gonna use Cam as an example. Cam, if you're in like education potentially, and that seems like it's what fits, then you would probably wanna know what's going on at like the larger government level of like, who is giving people money to do education? Where's that money coming from? What sort of stuff are those people prioritizing, right? I see we've added foster care in there. Cool, thanks for adding this, guys. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this. Any questions about like how these things are systems, or does that make sense to everybody? That there's the transportation system, the public health system.
So, and I think just to add on to what Catherine's saying, like what about the working in silos is like, we think, okay, well, the education system is, you know, everything from K through 12 education, right? Or preschool, or is that early childhood? Or where does one system stop and the next one begin? And they are so interconnected because if you look at within child welfare, we have an education specialist who's really working towards making sure that young people in foster care system are getting a high school, graduating from high school and getting an education, right? We have a, there's a McKinney-Vento specialist who's making sure that people are housed and families are housed and home in the education system. So they are super interconnected, and yet we often work in silos. And people say, what do you do? Well, I worked in juvenile justice. Oh, well, okay. That's like supposedly super narrow, right? But what we're all doing is really interconnected and woven together. Sorry, I just want to make that cross connection.
Zazie, do you have your hand raised for a question?
No, just a comment. I just wanted to say that, like, when I was coming into my job, the concept of public health was so intimidating to me, and I'm 3.5 years in, and it is still like there's so much to it. But I definitely agree with the intersectionality and it excites me when groups work together.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great comment too, because I feel the same way about stuff like public, like really with any of these things, it's such a big bucket that I'm like, I don't even, in some ways, like, I don't even like know what that means or like what even like fits under that, right? Like it's such big concepts. And I think especially with stuff like public health, like I think most people didn't have any concept of public health whatsoever until COVID. And even now people are sort of like, okay, pandemics, but like, I don't even know what else that would be counted as, right? So absolutely, it's like huge and it can be really difficult to conceptualize, which is sort of why we want to be able to break it down for you guys a little bit so you can at least recognize like, oh, this is sort of like a little piece of where I fit in. And this is like what that means for me of what's going on at the state level and how that affects my job. Sweet. Pearl, I think this is you.
Yeah, so just really putting that definition around it, right? It's a system, a group of interacting and interrelated elements, right, that work according to a set of rules. So when we think about policies and practices and guidelines on all the stuff that the legislature does, they're setting the rules that form what's happening, right, for youth work or for public health or for education, right? And it's influenced by everything, right? You can't, again, we can't work in silos. We can't look at education. We can't look at higher education without looking at how, socioeconomic status and making sure people are getting their food and housing needs met. We can't look at it without looking at how our early childhood system is either struggling or being successful, right? So, so really thinking about when we're thinking about systems, we're thinking about all of it. Sometimes we talk about one single system as a whole, but we're also thinking about all those elements, those rules, those policies, those procedures, the funding, which we're going to talk about a lot, how the funding influences systems. And yeah, then, a lot of the frameworks that we use to do some of our systems work. So, yes, so funding streams and who makes the decisions. Let me just pull up my cheat sheet here. We are, when we think about a lot of these systems, we're thinking about like, money comes in. Yeah, exactly. Like money's coming in, and where does that money come from? So, your organization's, your position, it was funded through something, right? So sometimes that's through federal funding, right? We have like federal systems of funding, and they say, hey, we're going to send dollars to for a SAMHSA grant, right? So thinking about public health and substance use, we can say we're going to fund tobacco cessation or whatever it is. And so that federal funding can come in. You also have state and local funding, right? So that money is coming in from taxes, right? From property taxes, from income taxes, from taxes on your car, revenue in your car, from fees from divorce. So, you pay a fee to get divorced, and that money goes to support domestic violence prevention and intervention programming, right? So like all this the system is funded through money and sources, a variety of sources that come in. There's also outside of the state system, there's also private foundations, right? So thinking about, many of you might work for nonprofits and organizations where you get money from not only individuals, but also private foundations that have their own, the Daniels Fund, right? Yeah, so you might, that might be a private fund, something, where you're getting money to do for a specific purpose, right? Keep clicking there. So thinking about state funding, there's something called the general fund, and this is where the legislature makes a lot of decisions about how they're going to spend their money, right? So across Colorado, all of our local legislators, elected officials, meet every year, and they set the budget, and the governor says, here's what I'd like to fund, and here are my priorities, and here are the things that are ongoing that we still have to continue to fund. And some of that is funded out of the general fund, which is like those tax dollars and things, and then other things are allocated specifically, like state cash funds. So if you think about well, actually, the general fund includes like the master tobacco settlement agreement. So for example, when, all of the tobacco companies had to settle after advertising to young people and adults about tobacco being healthy for you, that those big companies then have to pay a penalty. And so some of that funds gets allocated specifically for different purposes, right? And some of that might go to public health. But in my office, there's an organization called Tony Gramsci's Youth Services, and they get money directly from the tobacco master settlement agreement, right? There's also an opioid settlement. So again, these settlement dollars come through the general fund and get allocated for different purposes. You can, again, priorities for federal priorities. So depending on the administration and what's happening and what the goals of that administration are, different funding can come and go. But depending upon needs. So if we're talking about the immigration system, we're also talking about unaccompanied refugee minors and how children and young people, how much money organizations get to support those children and young people who might be crossing the border without families. So another example of how priorities of the government or the federal government can influence those organizations. What's my next slide, Catherine? Perfect. So then money goes out. So this is kind of maybe a little more relevant to you all in your work, right? So money then can go out through different ways. Well, we can have Tony Gramsci's Youth Services, as Catherine was noting in the chat, is one of the larger funders, and they put out an RFA, and that's a request for application. And they say, hey, we want to fund our priorities are violence prevention, child abuse prevention, substance use prevention for youth, dropout prevention for youth. So they'll put out these priorities, right? And they'll say, we're going to fund these things. And so then organizations can apply and say, hey, we have an idea about how we'd like to solve that problem for you. Right. So there's lots of different RFAs or RFPs out there. There's the sexual violence. These are just a few that I listed here off the top of my head, but sexual violence prevention program. There's an expelled and at-risk student services grant, and that helps young people with restorative justice programs in schools, or helps keep them in schools so that we can make sure that they're graduating, right? That's out of the Department of Education. In the public health realm, there's the communities that care funding. So maybe your position is funded through communities that care, which is really more of a systems level approach. We'll talk a little bit about that too when we get to the socioecological model. But substance abuse prevention block granting, 21st century learning centers. So there's a lot of different RFAs or RFPs that are put out there. There are also a lot of local allocations. So the money might go out for a specific purpose thank you. So maybe like within the human services realm, we give funding directly to counties, whether that's for their SNAP program. So SNAP, I should know what that means, but I don't. It's like, what does it stand for? Anybody? SNAP.
Supplemental Nutritional Assistance
Yes,
Program.
Thank you. It's providing food. Thank you.
This is what it's like when you have acronyms, guys. You're like, I don't know what that means, but I know what it is.
Or TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, right? So dollars that go specifically to help and support individuals, and that can go directly to counties, and then counties can then reallocate that. In child welfare, this is a lot of how our work works, right? We give money through either core services for mental health care and supports for families and therapy directly to counties, and then the counties like allocate that to either local organizations or even on the prevention end, so say that a young person needs a, you know, a class to get on their feet, then that can come through core services prevention dollars from county programs. Also, I don't know if you've heard of the collaborative management program, but this is again a program out of child welfare where we fund groups within counties to do collaborative wraparound supports. And they provide, it's got members from juvenile justice, it's got members from education, it's got members from child welfare, public health, and all those people come together to wrap around young people and make sure that they're supported to get the needs met. And those are local dollars. And then you've got pass-through entities. So sometimes what happens is all of this is all of this has gone through contracts and purchase orders to the state, right? But the pass-through entities, like maybe family resource centers, the state gives family resource centers funding, and then family resource centers can then fund specific programs within their community, including nonprofits and communities like that you're probably serving. Another example, the Boys and Girls Club Association is a pass-through entity. TGYS funds Boys and Girls Club Association, and they reallocate those funds across the metro area for Boys and Girls Clubs across the state and the metro area. So those are kind of like how the money both comes in and then the money goes out. When we're thinking about this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these like questions related to best practices, but thinking about youth voice and your position, how do you see this connecting?
I think that what Mountain Youth has done in the past is, look at what the youth bring up that they're seeing a problem with. Maybe that's, for example, there's like a program that they have, Tugia, that they got funding for this year. And it's basically just like a program to help students who don't speak English as well to succeed in virtual learning. And I would imagine that programs that they're looking for funding for specific like programs like that, that they would be able to apply that program into a direct like grant focus or whatnot to get that money into our type of program.
Yeah, fantastic. So Catherine, show the next slide because I think it really connects into what Kim is saying. So essentially, right, like somebody has said, we want to fund, I'm going to use violence prevention because it's my world, but we're going to fund violence prevention. And so they say, okay, we know that for violence prevention, what everybody needs is a fork, right? So everybody needs a fork, and that's going to fund violence prevention, and that's going to solve the problem. And that's what the government says and what the government thinks. And then when it gets to the community level, you've got down where you're talking to the young people or the communities, and they're like, actually, what we need is a spoon, right? And so they end up like kind of melding and making this spork, which is like not exactly what is needed and not exactly what is given, right? And so that's one of the ways that your positions or as young people can really be informative of our state systems is by elevating that youth voice and bringing it back and saying, thank you for saying that we all need forks, but we really need a spoon. And I don't want to end up with a spork. I really just want to make sure that what we get is what we need, right? In order to make it our program successful. But so many communities are operating with sporks because they're trying to fit funding and make it fit the needs that they have in their communities. But for example, Communities That Care goes to the communities and they say, hey, you tell us what you need. We want to know, go to the community, get community feedback, get feedback directly from the voice of youth, and tell us what you need so that you're not saying, so that somebody up here at the government level who says, or the legislature is saying, hey, we think everybody needs a fork, so we're going to legislate that everybody gets a fork, and then communities end up using sporks, right? Sorry, it's kind of a random example. Catherine was like, you're really going to talk about sporks on this call? And I'm
no,
like,
I love that example.
Really, I'm going to talk about sporks on this call. Awesome. So best practices, right? So when we think about how decisions are made at the state, a lot of times they're or in our systems, we think about like the best practices that are used to inform those decision making. So one of those on the next slide is our positive youth development, which we've already talked a lot about, right? So this is where we think about engaging youth as partners. This is one of the best practices that I'm paid to promote across the state. It's something that we're trying to have a comprehensive approach to. But again, it's a best practice that we are pushing as the state, and why we make decisions the way we do is because it's research-based and evidence-based and backed by information that says this approach works, right? So does anybody want me to go through positive youth development and like kind of explain each of the sections? I'm happy to do that. I just didn't know. So I'll go through just the basics here in the center, right? So the concept is in Colorado, because there are multiple types of positive youth development across the US, but in Colorado, we're using the positive youth development approach as how adults do business with young people, right? How we as adults interact with young people. And so we're looking to help young people through authentic relationships, this purple section in the center, through helping them develop skills and having the opportunity to practice those skills, right? And that's the core of PYD. And then we're doing that through these principles, the 5 principles that surround PYD, right? So making sure we're using strength-based approaches in language, right? So we don't want to break young people down by saying you're not doing this right. We want to look at the strength-based approach and how do we support young people in exploring their strengths and really being successful in what they do. And we want to make sure we're inclusive. So we're going to talk more about equity later, but inclusive being like making sure we have not only are we including youth voice, but we're looking at diversity, and we're looking to make sure that we are inclusive of people with differing abilities and differing, heritage or language, all of the above. And then engaging youth as partners. So again, one of the core principles of PYD is that we want to hear from youth about what it is they need, right? Nothing about us without us, this kind of concept. And so that's really a core principle of how adults should be looking at doing business, is business as usual, is engaging youth as partners to make sure that this is piece of that. Collaborative, right? So how are we connecting how are we getting out of our silos, right? We think about our silos at the state, but how are we looking across all of those silos, and how are we really making sure that we are connecting the dots? So, there's so-and-so is working on education over here, and so-and-so is working on education. We should see if there's a way that we can work together, right? And then sustainable. So how are we making positive youth development sustainable in the way that we do business? And so this is the way that all youth serving organizations could and should be approaching young people across Colorado. So big, fast overview of PYD for those
Girl,
of you.
Can I chime in real quick?
Anything.
I would love to know how many of you are like already familiar with PYD or like have heard of this before. And you can like do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Or
I like the thumbs up or thumbs sideways. I like that. Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
So
there are good, and maybe Catherine can put the PYD toolbox in the chat, but there's a lot of good resources and around PYD and trainings for adults to learn to better support young people in this way. And so, it's one of the frameworks we're using here at the state too, in our systems to change the way that we do business.
Yeah, and I just want to make the connection again of like, why are we talking about PYD when we're talking about state systems? Because PYD is something that the state has identified as like a best practice. And so the way that a lot of folks, like including, we talked about Tony Graham's Youth Services, which I believe is the largest funder of youth service programs in all of Colorado, funds programs across the state. This is like how they decide who gets money, is like, can you make an argument that you are including PYD in your program? Then like you're more likely to be able to get that money, right? And so that might be what's funding your job. It might be what's funding somebody else's job that's very similar to yours. And so Pearl's gonna talk about some other best practices. And so again, the reason we're talking about this is that this is how people at the state level who decide whether your organization gets money, whether you have a job in the first place. This is like how they're thinking about that in the first place and how they make decisions.
Thanks for really driving home that connection. I think it's really important for us to remember. And it's true, because in the RFAs for TGYS, there are questions around PYD, and then somebody who is reading that and saying, how is this program delivering upon this? How are they putting this into action? One of the other best practices that we're really trying to work on as a state is the shared risk and protective factor approach. So you may have heard about this conference. It's actually coming up next week, right? Yeah, 2 weeks. 2 weeks? 2 weeks. And so again, thinking about risk and protective factors as an approach, this is a framework in which we think about, well, I'm not working in my silo to end teen pregnancy or to do dropout prevention or violence prevention, but I'm looking at instead what I do is trying to reduce the risk factors that people have and promote the protective factors so that people are stronger, more resilient, and have coping mechanisms, right? So there are tons of risk and protective factors, and this is an example of a screen of risk factors for adolescent problem behavior. Well, I don't know what problem behavior is. It's like, I don't even want to define that. But here's an example, right? So risk factors can be, again, you can look at the availability of drugs as a risk factor for substance use and for violence. So if we're reducing the availability of drugs, then we're both working on substance use and violence prevention. It's a strategy to say we're all working on the same thing. We're connecting the dots and making sure that we're more powerful together in our approach about what we're doing, right? One of these things here, extreme economic deprivation, linked to everything, right? If everybody had, more resources at our fingertips, then maybe we could be, addressing all these issues. Family risk factors, right? Family conflict. So it can impact substance use, delinquency, teen pregnancy, school dropout, and then those protective factors. So thinking about the protective factors too, we know that a caring adult in people's lives are one of the biggest protective factors that we have. And so this is, again, that positive youth development approach. How are we increasing protective factors for young people across the state? So again, a framework that we're using to make decisions about how the funding and the system can improve itself, right? Thank you, Sedona. Yes, the Collaborative Youth Summit, really important, next couple of weeks, 2 weeks coming up. So young people's voices being integrated into what we're doing. Register. Thank you. Equity. So one of the other approaches that we, Catherine, if I'm talking too much and taking up too much time, will you just
you're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay, I'm just making sure that I know I tend to talk fast, but I also can just ramble on. So, so equity approaches. So again, we know that if you look at our society right now, we are it's built on oppression and inequity, and so many inequalities that are happening in our society. We can look at things that happened last summer with BLM, Black Lives Matter. You can look at the Asian hate, things that are happening. So really, when we start to think about equity approaches at the state, this is a slide I use in my positive youth development training, but we're talking, yes, we're talking about diversity. We are talking about diversity of people and perspectives. We're also talking about inclusion and voices, right? So how do we give those people with who represent that diverse or marginalized community or a voice to be included in the decision making and have the power to change the system like the wolves did, right? So again, including those voices so that we result in equity, because that's really what results from a good policy practice is we're creating equity within our system. So this is a big concept. It's a lot, and we're touching on it in like 2 seconds in this training. And so, if you go to the next slide, Catherine, I'll talk a little bit about the difference between equality versus equity. And you may have seen some of these graphics before. There's also like a really great bicycle one that we can reference. But, you know, here we have in the first one up in the upper left, we have, you know, equality versus equity. Equality is everybody gets the same brick to support them in looking over the fence. Equity is, you know, the difference between the short person being able to see over the fence and the tall person who doesn't need a brick, right? In this example, you know, is challenging because this is painting the problem with the person. So we're saying, hey, the problem is that you're too short and you can't see over the fence. And so, you know, we need to treat you equitably. So it's an okay graphic. It's evolved over time. This newer graphic here on the right is really more about thinking about our systems, right? And our systemic challenges. So the fence represents barriers, right? And so the barriers that these three people of the same size are facing is lower for some people and higher for others, right? So the barrier changes depending on who you are, maybe the community you live in, the zip code, right? The color of your skin, your sexual orientation, right? The barriers can be different for you. And you may be starting from a different place, right? We're thinking about the ground is also unlevel, right? So maybe your socioeconomic status is lower. Maybe you didn't have a parent who ever completed college, right? Maybe you don't know how to, maybe you don't have citizenship status, right? So all that, where you're starting could be at a different level. And so equality in this graphic is, again, everybody gets the same block. But equity is that the people that need more blocks because they're starting at a lower place or have more of a challenge get more blocks so that we can all see over the fence and participate in the system, right? This is again how we're thinking about equity approaches to help people participate and contribute to the system. So equality and equity here in the graphic on the bottom, we have communities, right? And so some communities have are struggling. If we give everybody equal access to resources, we can maybe they're still struggling and not able to be successful. But if we are able to say some communities are going to need more resources to really be successful, and that's what we need to do, then that's one way to approach it. So here's an equity approach TGYS has taken, right? We've identified communities across the state, 9 priority communities, and said these communities have risk factors and lower protective factors, and we'd like to prioritize them for funding. So that's one example of an equity approach. Another example of how TGYS made or trying to make the system more equitable is having tiered application system, right? So if you're a small nonprofit in a rural community, you may not be able to afford an amazing grant writer who can write a grant for a lot of money and get a lot of money, right? And so you're competing against, say, the Boys and Girls Club of America or Big Brothers Big Sisters or some of these national nonprofits that can afford a grant writer, right? And so having a tiered system of, hey, if you want to apply for a lot of money, we know you're going to be using a professional grant writer, you apply here. And if this is your first time applying for a grant, you can apply in tier 1 and you can see if you can get funding in this lower tier, right? So attempting to equalize the playing field for not only our smaller community nonprofits, but maybe nonprofits who are trying to innovate in this space and don't have a long history, or say, Black or African-American run nonprofits who are really serving that community from the community themselves, right? So really trying to think about ways that we can have an equity approach with our state systems. And again, your voice matters, right? As a young person. So how can we make sure that we're including young people's voices to create more equity in the community? If you're out there and you're saying, nobody here needs a spork, people really need a spoon, then how can we try to make sure that our application reflects the spoon? I'm really talking in metaphors today. Hopefully this is.
And Pearl, just a time check, you have just a couple minutes to do these final 2 practices.
Okay, thank you. These are much more simple, so I appreciate it. So another one of the one that you see here, kind of a best practice approach, is the 2-generation approach. You may have heard it called 2-gen, 2-generation approach. Well, the idea is, again, a framework around how we're making decisions is, well, should we just fund programs that support the child only, right? So on the right, you're going to have funding that goes only to the child, but then the parents can't get any support. Or are we going to have a program that tries to support the parent on the right, and then the child doesn't get any support? Well, in a 2-gen approach, we're really focusing on the whole family. And this is a strategy that's, again, designed to lift people out of poverty and create more equity so that people can participate in the system. So sometimes we need, this framework is really helpful for thinking about, okay, yeah, you as a family, maybe this is trying to change, again, generational access issues to college or to mental health services. If we just give the youth mental health services, but don't give the family mental health services, then are we actually supporting the family as a whole? So just thinking about the 2-gen approach. And then the last framework, which I don't really have a good graphic for, so I created this little baby graphic, is wraparound approaches. So thinking about the whole child or the whole kid or the whole person as an individual. So wrapping around and making sure we're serving young people as a whole, right? So when we think about this, it's like, okay, I may be an expert in substance use prevention. I keep using the examples that you've given me about where your jobs are and where you're working. But that has also meant that this young person also has a drug charge in the juvenile justice system. So if I'm really going to help them as a holistic individual, I not only have to address the substance use, I need to address the young person's family dynamic and maybe their legal charges and juvenile justice. So it's really, and then education, like how are they going to survive once they get a job and move on? So we're looking at employment and we're looking at education. So the wraparound approach is really making sure that we're not just looking at addressing, say, substance use in its silo, but again, like how are we thinking about making sure the young person has all the supports they need, or the family has all the supports they need around a comprehensive wraparound supports. So these are all best practices that we use to really inform how the systems are organized, how the systems make decisions, what people are, Stasi, thank you, holistic approach, holistic approach. I think wraparound is a very technical term, you're right, it's like a very clinical term for this type of approach, but yes, a holistic approach is probably a really good way to also frame that. So any thoughts? I just went through all those best practices really fast.
I just have a quick comment. I've thought about this a lot, but would you say that like wraparound services, thinking about the whole person, is related to shared risk and protective factors, where we're thinking about how one factor influences a whole bunch of different things?
Yes, they're almost like two different sides of the coin, right? So, when we think about like, we can think, yes. So you could say, okay, to really, if we're wraparound is more of an intervention. So wraparound services is more of an intervention. So once we've already we're moving along the side, and we're going to talk about prevention, intervention, and treatment here in a minute. But when we think about shared risk and protective factors is really prevention focused. If we could really get everybody socioeconomically stable, what would we be able to prevent, right? All of these things in the same bucket, right? right? Versus like wraparound is like, okay, we already know we have somebody in the system and we need to make sure they have all the supports to either exit the system or be successful moving forward. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Is this for me, Catherine?
This one is me.
Oh.
Cool. So relating back to what we said that we would teach you guys about, right? So we talked about how your position came to be. You're here to provide youth perspective. That kind of integrates with positive youth development and equity, right? Of having young people who are representing their communities, because historically, when we did stuff for young people, we never asked them about it. Like that didn't happen. It was adults telling you like, no, this is what you guys need. Data tells us, and we feel pretty good about that. So I talked about how your positions came to be. We've talked about who decides and oversees who's getting funding, right? We talked about there's federal funders, there's state funders, there's private foundations. We have encouraged you guys that you should talk to your supervisor if you don't know how you're getting funded, because whatever is in your job description, that's coming from somewhere, and that's coming from whoever you're getting funded by, right? And so we've also talked about these best practices of PYD. We've talked about equity. We've talked about 2Gen. We've talked about wraparound services. That's all the way that the people who are giving you and your organization money, that's the way that they're thinking of who should I give this big pot of money to, right? That's from tax money or wherever it's from. So we've talked a lot about that. I am going to take us through some of the ways then that like this is actually like we think about like applying these things, right? And then we're going to talk about like how you can use that information to be able to better understand your job and to really sort of be able to help others, right? And I'm talking about others in your community, and I'm talking about like whatever is in your job description of what projects and programs that you work on. I want you guys to be able to use this information to figure out like, okay, I think that I'll use myself as an example, to be honest with you. Here in rural Gilpin County a year ago, we didn't have any services whatsoever for youth over the age of 12. They did not exist in our county. If you were over 12, sorry, like that sucks for you. Outside of like our one school that we have in this county, you weren't able to do anything after school. You just got to go home and not have anything to do. So we ended up talking to a bunch of young people, and they said, we'd like to have a place to go after school, and we would want people who don't like yell at us every time that like we go to a place to be able to hang out. And that's how we decided to start this program of we're going to do an after school program, and it's not going to be for 5 to 12-year-olds because we know that 12-year-olds don't want to hang out with 5-year-olds. And so instead, we're going to make it like really intentionally a teen-focused program that's going to be for middle and high school students, right? And so I want you guys to feel like if you have a similar idea where you're like, actually, I think that what young people in my communities need are like better mental health services, or we need to like do some stuff with like the juvenile justice system, whatever it is. I want you guys to sort of feel empowered of like, you know what the language is of how you can talk to people who will give you money to be able to do those things, right? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about state systems. Is everybody with me so far?
Catherine's really good at getting money.
I love money, guys. Can I see a thumbs up if people are like still feeling good and we can plow on? Because I know we've done a lot of talking at you. Fantastic. Okay, I'll take us through this pretty quick. This is the Socioecological Model. Has anybody seen it before? You can give me a thumbs up if you have. If not, I'll assume you have not. Okay, a couple of people. Sweet. So what this amazing model is, don't worry too much about like what those little words were. I will walk you through it. So it's a way of us being able to sort of conceptualize like, okay, how do different environmental factors in interactions between different people, individuals, and sets of groups and whatever, how does that create the society that we live in, right? And so here we have individual youth, right? We're talking specifically about young people here. So individual youth, they have certain behaviors. You guys have stuff that you do. It might be school. It might be stuff you do after school. You might not even be in school right now. That's cool too. And you have personal skills, right? This is like a lot of like what you guys are like as individuals. But we know that we are not actually like a little cesspool of like individuals interacting with each other and just bouncing off each other. So there are other things that are affecting your behavior, that are affecting the things that you do, the opportunities that you have, right? So we have family and relationships. So that's your family, your friends. This is sort of your interpersonal relationships with the other people that you're interacting with, right? So they're all functioning on that individual level too. But then we have this interpersonal connection. And so when we're talking about programs that people are funding, maybe giving you guys money for, an intervention that is, it's at individual level might be like, I come in and I tell you guys individually to not do drugs, right? And you're like, sweet, now I know as an individual, I shouldn't be doing drugs. The family relationship side, that might be where we're coming in as an organization and we decide to do something about, we are going to teach about relationship violence, right? And we're going to talk to people who are in relationships, and that might be romantic relationships, it might be friendships, it might be like between parents and children, and we're going to provide some sort of education on like that relationship level. And then you have the community level. So that's where we're getting bigger now, right? It's no longer like a family unit we're focusing on an entire school. We're focusing on, right, after school programs with my example for myself. And so what this looks like is where you're sort of providing like this broader array of services. So it might be health services, family support, right? Job opportunities. These are all listed on this example. And so we're really exploring like, how can we do some sort of program or intervention or whatever within a school, within a workplace. It's bigger than the family unit, right? And then we get really big, and this is kind of what we've been talking about. We talk about policies and systems, which can feel so huge that it feels like none of us even has an impact on them, right? Because it comes down to like economic policy, educational policy, different stuff, like, right, when we're talking about decisions that are made by the state. This is kind of what we're talking about, is that really big systems-wide lens of all that stuff we've been talking about, where people, the state might sit there and go, you know what, we have decided that we have done a bunch of research on positive youth development, and we think it's an approach that makes things better for young people. So at the policy level, we're going to start funding people who do positive youth development really well in their work. Are you guys still with me? Can I see some thumbs up, or I don't know, the opposite of that if we're not? Great. Sweet. Let me just do a time check on myself. I think we have time for this.
I think you should.
Sweet. Okay, we're going to do it. So we're going to talk a little bit. We've talked about the socioecological model. We'll come back to that in a minute. And we're going to talk about the difference between prevention, intervention, and treatment. We're going to watch this fun video so you don't have to listen to me talk at you. Does this sound okay for everybody? Fabulous.
Looking good.
How do you support individuals in achieving their highest level of health? What role do you play in creating healthy, thriving, resilient communities free from substance abuse, violence, or suicide? This short video will take a look at prevention, break down some terminology, and help you see where you fit in. Let's start with a story. Imagine if you saw someone in your community fall over the edge of a cliff. You would probably be relieved to find an ambulance at the bottom, ready to whisk them off to be cared for. Now imagine if you saw it happen again and again and again. You might ask, how can we catch them before they get to the bottom? And then maybe you'd work with other people in your community to put up a net to catch people before they hit the ground. But the net you put up is not perfect, and some people continue to fall through the cracks and around the edges to the bottom. You realize that you need to do something to prevent people from falling over the edge in the first place, so you build a fence at the top of the cliff. As you are admiring the new fence, you start to notice something else. Some people in your community are living right on the edge of the cliff and are still at much greater risk for falling, even with the added protection of the fence. You start to wonder why it might be that some people are so close to the edge while others are farther away. Now let's take a deeper look at this story. There are many social, economic, and environmental factors that impact our health and the choices that we have available to us. Factors within our families, schools, and communities can serve to protect us or to put us at greater risk. when we live in an unsafe area or face violence at home, when we don't know where our next meal will come from and have few job options, when we face discrimination or are isolated without social support, when we have little connection to school or have experienced academic failure, when we don't have a trusted adult in our lives, or when it's easy for us to get drugs, we are in effect living at the edge of the cliff. Tackling these shared risk and protective factors, or social determinants of health, is considered upstream prevention. We are moving people away from the cliff's edge and reducing their risk for violence, substance abuse, suicide, teen pregnancy, dropping out of school, and more. Our fence represents primary prevention. Some examples of this might be a mentoring program that teaches parenting skills or helps young people develop coping skills. It might be a policy that raises the age to buy tobacco or adds a health class in our schools. These efforts seek to do things like stop violence before it occurs, prevent a young person from using tobacco, marijuana, alcohol, or other substances, or to support a student before they drop out of school. If we could prevent everything, that would be great. But we know that's not the case. This is where the net, which represents secondary prevention or intervention, comes in. Something negative has already happened, and we're looking to help get things back on track or to intervene and prevent them from getting worse. Examples might include a diversion program, a collaborative management program, or screening efforts. And even with all of these in place, we know we need treatment facilities for those struggling to overcome addiction, hospitals for those suffering from injury, and jails for those who have committed serious offenses. This is referred to as tertiary prevention, and it has the goal of rehabilitation, preventing death or future offense. To be successful, we need a comprehensive approach, one that complements treatment and intervention services with primary and upstream prevention efforts. Regardless of where your day-to-day work focuses, we all have an interest in seeing kids and communities live and thrive away from the cliff's edge.
Oh God, it's doing the thing where I can't go. There we go. Got it, guys. Yes. So, recap, I'm going to call on you guys because I want to hear people's voices that aren't mine. Prevention. What does that mean? What are we doing when we're preventing things? Stasi, go.
Okay, talking about prevention. I'm sorry, what was the question about it?
What is prevention?
Oh, okay. Prevention is, oh gosh, how do I explain this without using the word? Working on supporting people to make sure that something bad doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I've been doing prevention for 3 years, guys.
Great definition. Okay, I'm going to call on somebody else. And remember, we're just recapping the video. And if you're like, oh God, I wasn't paying attention, that's fine. Intervention. What does intervention mean if we weren't able to prevent something from happening in the first place? Sedona, what do you think?
So is it okay if I add a little bit to prevention as well? That's definitely like the area I work in. I would just add like using upstream approaches to really support people and communities to thrive. And I think, you know, a lot of the times we don't necessarily do that, or we don't have this equity approach in our systems and society, which results in the need for intervention. So that is when something has happened that has gotten someone in the system or in a place where they need extra support. So providing those services, or yes, I guess services to support them in, I guess, moving out of that position, or being able to be more supported going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Great summary and great additions. Yeah, so intervention is going to be at sort of like the early stages of something has happened, right? It hasn't been prevented, but now we are doing some sort of program to try to stop like the problem behavior or whatever else that it is. Sweet. Treatment. I'm gonna call on Katya.
So I have my camera off because of my internet, but I've also been around prevention and stuff. My first position as a youth advisor or young adult providing impact was in substance prevention and intervention for Boulder County. And what I got to learn a lot about prevention is that, you know, it starts at a very early age. And so the sooner you have conversations around sex ed, you know, birth controls and stuff like that, the sooner you can prevent a teenage pregnancy. That was just one example. And I also heard the Upstream theory or story of how if you know you have lots of fish dying, you're not just going to keep removing the dead fish. You're going to go all the way upstream and actually figure out what is causing these fish to, you know, die, and fix the problem. I also know from, you know, lots of intersectionality work and stuff like that, that may not be the case for everybody. I also grew up in a Hispanic household, and, you know, talking about therapy with my father doesn't go well as it goes with my mother. So just knowing the difference within culture and, you know, being first generation and stuff like that is very important to my work, because I'm also now in mental health, in the mental health realm. And, you know, having these facts and knowing how young adults within Hispanic cultures or households, you know, how they think, what they've been taught, what they've been told, and the lack of trust in the systems has to also be addressed, not just preventing them from doing drugs, you know, drugs, is that each household has different cultural norms, you know, that we have to be.
And now she vanished. Everything she was saying was so great. Oh, are you back, Katya?
Yes.
Sweet, keep going.
Okay. So also from, you know, like I just recently ran a panel and was also part of a different panel providing input to mental health providers, you know, around how to approach a young adult in crisis. Most of my young adults agreed that having police as first responders creates more fear, you know, and that they identify firefighters as safe people versus police, you know. And when speaking to because we also had another panel that same day with Servicios de la Raza, which, you know, is predominantly Hispanic or Latin. And all these young adults, you know, basically said they don't trust mental health providers because of, you know, their parents' status, being told not to share that information, having to hide from different systems. So all these things, you know, have to be addressed when you're also talking about prevention, you know. Cultural competence, I think we talk a lot about it at the state level, but internally we're also not doing the work. But anyways, sorry for going out track. You know, I started with prevention and my current journey, and, you know, the need for intersectionality framework when we're talking about different services such as prevention, public health, mental health.
That was awesome. And that was all totally on track. So don't even apologize. Yeah, sweet. I love everything you guys said. I'm going to like basically not talk quite so much because you guys covered it for me. Yeah, so right, so this is a spectrum, and like we said, we tend to be where we want to be on the prevention side of things, and we want to consider all those factors that Sedona and Stasi and Katya just talked about, and that we are trying to get away from this treatment side, right, where treatment ends up being where like that's actual like a rehabilitation, right, after we feel like behaviors have gotten so bad that it needs to have like a serious intervention or rehabilitation of some kind. We have little time left, but what I really want you guys to be able to think about is just, again, where do you fit in with your specific work in your job? And if you don't know, like we invite you to go and talk to your supervisor once you're done with this, right? Or whatever the next time is that you work. And this is combining those things that we talked about. So you can see that this is like the socioeconomic model, where it's societal, community, relationship, individual. So think about where your job sits on that. Like, are you doing stuff that's just like this like very narrow focus on individuals and changing behaviors? Are you way up here at societal because you work for a state agency? Are you somewhere in the middle? And then are you on the prevention side? Are you trying to stop things from happening before it becomes a problem in the first place? Are you on the early intervention side, where you're coming in after like some sort of problem has already cropped up and you're trying to intervene? Or are you somewhere there on the treatment side? We were gonna do like an activity related to this, but it actually is 6 p.m. and we're technically done with our training now. But yeah, Sedona's posting in the chat. I would love you guys, like if everybody can just post in the chat where they think they might be, or if you're like, I don't know, please put that in the chat. Like, I think it's good to recognize if we're like, I have no idea where I work in this. While you're typing, Pearl has the evaluation survey link up. Pearl and I are gonna skip out so that you guys can sort of talk amongst yourselves. Stasi and Lauren will be kind of leading you guys in a discussion about the sort of trainings that you would like to see in the future, how this one went. Yeah. Oh, and then Pearl also has that form to fill out for your gift card to make sure that you get that. So that stuff will remain in the chat. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how. There we go, guys. And I'm gonna go ahead and make Stasi a co-host.
Thank you, Catherine.
I just want to encourage everybody to be, please fill out the evaluation. This is our pilot training. And so we really are trying to improve. So anything that you have, small and mighty, will help us. So please put that in. And if you can, stay for the focus group. And Catherine and I will see you all later.
Yep.
Thank you, ladies.